provides a best fit to our observations, and perhaps more importantly, to understand the parameters of that model to be able to learn something about the dynamics of our universe. And our current standard cosmological model is the Lambda Cold Dark Matter, or Lambda Cdm model, which is named after the main constituents of the universe, which we infer from observations. And this model is based on Einstein's general relativity, specifically under the assumptions of a homogeneous and isotropic spacetime. And this gives rise to the FLRW, Friedmann-Lemaitre, Robertson-Walker class of models in general relativity. And specifically, the way that we use this model is it's typically used as a zeroth order or a kind of average description for the universe on large scales. And this is motivated by the observation that the galaxy distribution transitions to being statistically homogeneous on about 100 megaparsec scales or so. And so this model provides a pretty good consistent fit to most of our cosmological observations for such a simple few parameter model. However, of course, we still have this 95% of the universe, which remains physically unexplained. And in addition to that, as our cosmological data gets more and more precise, we're seeing more and more tensions between the predictions of the Lambda Cdm model and our observations coming to light. And the one that we're, of course, most familiar with and probably sick of hearing about by now is the Hubble Tension. And so this is a discrepancy between Lambda Cdm predictions of the local expansion rate, or H0, and low redshift determinations of the expansion rate directly from supernova. And so this plot is showing the value of H0 on the y-axis as a function of publication year, where the blue points are showing the low redshift supernova measurements, and the red points are showing the Lambda Cdm predictions from measurements of the CMB. And I've just added this extra point over here showing you guys can't, I've got my little Zoom window, which is awkwardly buzzing around. Can you see that?
I see your cursor, yeah.
Okay, great. But you can't see this little video Zoom window that I've got. Awesome. So yeah, so I just added these extra points here where this blue one is the most recent data point from the SHOES collaboration with the Pantheon Plus supernova. And here is the most recent Planck value as well. So these two values are in 5 sigma tension with one another. So obviously a lot of people are really interested in this, and this does motivate some investigation into the main assumptions underlying the FLRW or the Lambda Cdm model. And so specifically, the assumptions of homogeneity and isotropy imply that the FLRW metric describes all distances in the universe. And so here is the metric tensor just for flat space at the moment, where we've split up the time component and the space component here. And from this, you can see that all distances in the universe are described by one single function of time, the scale factor A of t. And as I mentioned before, the way that we use the FLRW model is typically as a background or a zeroth order description, either with small perturbations added on top to describe large scales, where we neglect the small scale dynamics going on and just consider kind of long mode small perturbations, or we consider it as a background for our cosmological simulations, which are typically use Newtonian dynamics to describe the nonlinear interaction and formation of cosmological structure. And in addition to these assumptions, the actual interpretation of most of our cosmological data also relies on the assumption of an FLRW metric as a background description. And so, for example, the measurements of the local Hubble constant, the detection of the baryon acoustic oscillation feature, and the analysis of the CMB all rely on an FLRW geometry. And so from now on, I'm just going to talk about more low redshift or local measurements. And so here's an example of some supernova type 1a. We've got the magnitude versus redshift relation down here, where they go up to about 0.4. So each point here is a supernova, and we can see that with some scatter, they fit a straight line pretty well, which tells us the universe is expanding. That's good news. And then to actually be able to extract any cosmological information from this line, so to say, what does the slope mean for the expansion of our universe, we need to parameterize it to be able to infer any cosmological information. And typically to do that, we use the FLRW model. And so if we're considering low redshift, so a redshift of less than 1, we can write the luminosity distance as a Taylor series expansion in the redshift like this, where each of the different order coefficients are defined in terms of these 4 cosmological parameters, which I'm sure may be familiar with. So we've got the Hubble parameter, which is I introduced before with respect to the Hubble tension, the deceleration parameter and the jerk, which are just the second and third derivatives of the scale factor, and the curvature parameter, which is directly related to this constant K, which describes the global curvature of spatial sections in the FLRW universe. And so in getting here, we've assumed an FLRW metric, but we haven't assumed anything about the equations that govern the scale factor. So we haven't assumed any particular energy density of the universe, for example. And so this is typically referred to as Flw Cosmography. And this is the framework that's used to infer the local Hubble parameter from supernova data. And so obviously using the FLRW metric gives us this very simple relation for the luminosity distance as a function of redshift. And given the historically limited amount of available cosmological data, the assumption of the FLRW model has historically been justified because we've got limited data. We want to extract any kind of cosmological information from it. We need to make some quite simplifying assumptions to be able to do that. But with the increasing volume and the just amount of data in our upcoming surveys, we'll eventually be able to remove these assumptions of exact homogeneity and isotropy, and to either remove the FLRW background or to infer some local kinematic properties of the universe. And so this will allow for truly model independent analysis outside of the context of the FLRW model. And in particular, my collaborator Asta Heinessen derived this luminosity distance cosmographic expansion without making any assumption of an FLRW metric or any kind of underlying metric tensor or any form of the field equations. So this is really the most general cosmographic expansion that you can have. And in this expansion, she found there is a finite number of degrees of freedom, which implies that it can, in theory, be used for cosmological analysis. But of course, when you don't make these simplifying assumptions, you have a lot of independent degrees of freedom. There are 61 to be precise. And so therefore, to constrain all of these, you need a lot of data with very, very good sky coverage, which we don't currently have. And so before I show you her formalism specifically, just a bit of housekeeping to make sure we're all on the same page. So what we're doing is we're considering observers and emitters co-moving with the fluid flow, so moving with 4 velocity u mu. And these observers are observing incoming null rays or photons with 4 momentum k mu, and the energy and redshift as defined in the observer's frame, the energy is just the contraction of this 4 momentum of the null ray with the observer's 4 velocity. And then the redshift is just defined as the ratio of these two, of the energy at the source to the observed energy. And one thing we'll make use of is this decomposition of the photon 4 momentum, where it's just normalized by the photon energy, and we've split it up into these two components, one along the direction of the observer's 4 velocity and another one defined by this vector E mu, which you can just think of as the position of the source on the observer's sky, so just the direction that the observer is looking. And so in Asta's formalism, in this completely general framework, these coefficients of each order of redshift in the luminosity distance expansion are now defined in terms of these curly parameters, which we call the effective Hubble, the effective deceleration, effective curvature, and the effective jerk. And the reason we say effective is because while these parameters do sit in the same place in this Taylor series expansion as their FLRW equivalents. So for example, the Hubble parameter enters in this well-known Z equals H naught D first order Hubble law relation here. And similarly for all the other parameters, their interpretation, once we abandon the FLRW model, is not so simple as what we're used to. And so for example, the deceleration parameter in the FLRW metric looks like this down here. So as I mentioned, it's related to the second derivative of the scale factor, which is the acceleration of the length scales in the space-time metric. And so from this, you can see that within the FLRW model, there's this very clear relation that if you measure a negative Q, that implies a positive A double dot and therefore acceleration of length scales. However, in the generalized formalism, this curly Q parameter can actually, in theory, be negative without any actual acceleration of length scales of the space-time metric. Just because when you include inhomogeneity and anisotropy, this becomes not so simple of a connection, but I'll show this in more detail in a few slides. And similarly for the effective curvature in the FLRW metric, this omega k parameter is directly proportional to the curvature of spatial sections in the FLRW metric, whereas the general curvature parameter is not necessarily connected to the spatial curvature. It's more just an observational parameter. So we still have this term here, which is coming from the 4 Ricci tensor of the space-time, but there is no simple relation to the spatial curvature anymore. And so that's just the reason for naming them effective parameters. And so similarly with the FLRW metric, this is valid for low redshift, so redshift less than 1. One thing we did find in our paper, which I won't go into too much detail in, you can see Appendix A if you are interested in it, is we found that this truncation at third order, which is just as far as Asta has gone in her derivation, when you consider all of the inhomogeneity and anisotropy, you can really only probe very narrow redshift ranges. So we found that out to a redshift of 0.06, this third order truncation will give you a 1%, or should give you about a 1% determination of the exact luminosity distance. And that's a very, very rough order of magnitude estimate. And we're currently in the process of looking into this a bit more, which I'll mention towards the end of our talk. And we found that to fit to 1%, again, to approximate luminosity distance to 1% out to redshift of 0.1, you would need about up to 8th order terms in this expansion. And that's easy to understand in the sense that if you're considering all inhomogeneity and anisotropy, your DL of Z line really looks like this. It's very rapidly oscillating. And so to fit a curve to that, you need higher order terms. And so another good thing about this formalism is that all of these effective parameters can be written as multipole series expansions in the direction of observation. So this vector E mu that I introduced before. And so as an example here for the effective Hubble parameter, we have 3 terms. We've got one term, a monopole component, which is isotropic on the observer's sky, which is given by the isotropic fluid expansion. And we have a dipole term, which is given by this A mu, which is the acceleration of the observer. And so if your observer is close to geodesic, this term will be close to 0. If they are on a geodesic, it will be 0. And we have a quadrupole term here, which is given by the shear tensor of the fluid. And so this is, I just want to stress, this is really an exact series expansion. It's not arbitrarily truncated. These are really all the contributions of anisotropy to this parameter. And so just to go to the next parameter, I'm not going to show all of them. I'll just show the deceleration parameter just for illustrative purposes. So this obviously gets a little bit more complicated as we go to higher order in redshift. But similarly, we can see we've got a monopole component given by this Q0 here, which is the first line in these coefficients. And specifically this first term here, this d theta dt, is the term that reduces to the A double dot term that we're used to seeing in the FLRW metric. And so this is the term that probes the acceleration of length scales in the local vicinity of the observer. And this is the only term that survives in the FLRW limit. And so we can see we've got all of these other contributions from inhomogeneity and anisotropy, and it's at least, it's not super simple whether we can totally neglect all of them. And I'll just point out again, the dipole term, this Q1 coefficient given by the second line down here. The main contributions to this will be these 2 terms here, which are spatial derivatives of the local expansion near the observer and a spatial derivative of the shear tensor as well. And so these are the kind of terms that we expect to dominate, since we expect spatial derivatives to dominate over just the expansion term, for example.
Haley,
and yes?
Are the A's in those equations the acceleration of the fluid or the observer?
So they're the acceleration of the observer congruence. So I think Asta has assumed that the observer and the emitter are in the same congruence description. So it would be typical to take that as the fluid, but I don't think it's enforced to be of the fluid. I think you're very far away. I can see you nodding. Okay.
So for a geodesic observer, they all vanish immediately.
Yes, exactly. So that is one simplification you can make. And later in the talk, I'll point to another paper by Asta and I, where we do consider some simplifications to this formalism. And so, yeah, you can easily see that if you consider an observer that's exactly geodesic, you're going to get a whole lot of these terms vanishing. That's for sure.
Right. Thanks.
No worries. And so, as I mentioned before, this general formalism has many, many degrees of freedom. And so we can't quite use it on real data just yet. And so what we want to do is to find some reasonable assumptions that we can make to simplify it a bit. And like Tim said, to assume that our observers are geodesic is one of the obvious simplifications we could make. Although aside from that, it's a priori hard to know what reasonable is and to know which terms in these kind of complicated expressions that we can actually ignore. And so what we wanted to do in this paper was to calculate these parameters in a realistic cosmological simulation and then determine which anisotropic contributions are most dominant in each parameters. And so to do this, we wanted to maintain as similar a level of generality as is present in Asta's formalism, and specifically the generality with regard to the metric tensor. So in her formalism, she didn't assume any form of the metric tensor. And so we want to stay as close to that as possible. And for that reason, we use numerical relativity simulations. So numerical relativity is a computational method that allows us to solve Einstein's field equations with no simplifying assumptions for gravity, so no weak fields, or any assumptions for geometry. And so there's no assumptions of any kind of flat space-time. And this is based on a 3+1 split of our 4-dimensional space-time into a 3-dimensional space and 1-dimensional time component. And that's illustrated on this figure on the left-hand side, where we've removed a dimension so that we can draw it. So here we've got a 3-dimensional space-time being split into a series of 2-dimensional spatial surfaces and 1 dimension of time. And then using this kind of split, we can then project Einstein's equations into these spatial surfaces, and the equations then become a set of evolution equations for the metric and curvature describing these spatial surfaces. And that means that we can advance Einstein's equations in all generality. And so this is a really popular and successful method for studying a bunch of different relativistic phenomena. And it's especially been very important in the analysis and detection of gravitational waves and merging neutron stars and supernova explosions over here, and some relativistic jets from accretion disks around black holes. And more recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, has also been applied to inhomogeneous cosmology as well. And so there are a few groups that have been working on this over a few years of its history, but in the interest of time, I'll just talk a little bit more about how we do it. So we use a code called the Einstein Toolkit, which is a part of the Cactus infrastructure. And so this is a really widely used free open source numerical relativity code that's used a lot for simulations of binary black holes and neutron stars. And in particular, I wrote a module called FLRW solver to just pass initial data into this already widely used numerical relativity framework. And it's specifically built to initialize realistic cosmological spacetimes based on, for example, power spectrum of the CMB. And you can see this paper here where we did a few test cases using this module, and it is freely available. So if you want to go to this repository and download it, and there's detailed instructions how to incorporate it into the Einstein Toolkit if you are interested. And please email me if you do want some help on this. And just a few words about the initial conditions and the simulations themselves. So we start our simulations as a linearly perturbed FLRW background, and specifically these perturbations are Gaussian random, and they're drawn from the matter power spectrum at the CMB. And as for the evolution itself, we are currently matter dominated, so we don't have any dark energy. And this is just because the evolution codes that we use weren't written for cosmology. They're written to simulate neutron stars, for which you don't really need a cosmological constant. And so this is in progress at the moment. Is my PhD student, Michael Williams at Canterbury in New Zealand, is adding in a cosmological constant to our simulations to add that extra element to them. And in addition, we use a fluid approximation for the hydrodynamics in our simulation, which means we don't have n-body particles. We have a continuous fluid description. And so this limits us in the minimum scale that we're able to sample while still being a good description of the fluid. And so before I go on to show you some the simulations that we use in this paper and some results, just another quick note. In this general cosmography, one of the assumptions that ASA did have to make was that the luminosity distance is a monotonic function of the redshift, just to be able to write it as a Taylor series expansion. And so what this means is that we can't have any collapsing structures, because this would give us a multi-valued DLZ line. And then that means that our expansion must be positive everywhere. And so then that means that we can only sample large scale structures in these simulations. And so to get around that, we decided to just make our box sizes really, really big so that our individual grid cells were 100 and 200 megaparsec in 2 separate simulations. And this is just to be able to explicitly exclude any structure beneath this scale. So we can really safely say that there are no collapsing structures beneath that scale in our simulation. And so here is just some 2-dimensional snapshots of the simulation that we used in this paper. So on the top left is the density field. We've got the scalar expansion rate over here, where green regions are expanding faster and red regions are expanding slower. And down the bottom is the shear field, and on the bottom right here is the acceleration. And so I will just, another quick note to emphasize that we have no dark energy. And so for all our comparisons, we are looking at the Einstein de Sitter, or the matter-dominated flat FLRW model in this case. And we do find that when we spatially average over these simulations on large scales, that they do match the EDS model to within our numerical errors. And so the small scale anisotropic effects we're looking at are really effects that are within a universe that globally matches the EDS model. And so now our step for actually calculating these parameters, what we do is step 1 is to place a set of observers at random positions in the simulation domain. And then step 2 is each observer gets assigned a certain set of lines of sight, which may represent, for example, a survey that they're interested in. And then for each line of sight, which represents a unique EMU vector, we then calculate the effective Hubble parameter based on the scalar expansion, the acceleration, and the shear tensor at the observer position. And then once we have the effective Hubble parameter, we can then get the effective deceleration and the jerk as our first and second derivatives of that Hubble parameter along the direction of the incoming null ray. And then the curvature parameter is already defined by the deceleration parameter and this Ricci focusing term, which again is just calculated as the 4 Ricci tensor at the observer position contracted with the 4 momentum of the incoming null ray for that individual line of sight. And so the first thing I'll show you is some observers with extremely well-sampled skies. So this is where all of their lines of sight are drawn from heel pix directions with n side is 32. So then you end up with just under 12,500 isotropic lines of sight. So each one of these points is an individual line of sight. And so we calculate the parameter for each one of these, and then we can really look at a kind of smooth all sky map of the anisotropic contribution to these parameters. And so here is an example just for one observer in the simulation. So on the top left, we're showing the effective Hubble parameter relative to the EDS Hubble parameter. And similarly for the deceleration, the curvature, and the jerk. And so the main point of this slide is that these anisotropic contributions are there. They are, we can see them quite easily in these maps. And further, we can actually start to distinguish the kind of dominant contributions to each of these parameters. And now, so for example, in the Hubble parameter, the quadrupole is the dominant contribution, as we can see, which is expected since we only have a dipole and a quadrupole contribution to the Hubble parameter. And we expect the dipole to be very small because our observers are very close to geodesic. And we can see the dipole dominating the deceleration parameter. As I pointed out, the contribution to that term is local spatial gradients in the expansion and shear near the observer. So this makes sense that this would be the dominant contribution. And as I said, this is just one observer. We did this for 100 in total for each simulation. And so this is just an example of the kind of diversity that we see among our observers. And so every observer is unique and different, even though typically we do see the same multipoles dominating the signals. So all of our observers, unsurprisingly, have a quadrupole dominating their signals. We can see by the top left of each of these. And more often than not, we have a dipole dominating the deceleration parameter and the curvature as well, which we can see as we just kind of glance around these plots. But we wanted to get a more kind of quantitative assessment of which multipoles are present among our observers. And so that was the job of our Part 3 or master's student, Jess Cowell, who's at the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge, and co-supervised with Suhail Dehuan and myself. And so in her project, she's been working with 100 of these observer maps like this, trying to do a quantitative analysis of which multipoles are dominating for each observer. And so in these plots, these violin plots, what she's doing is she's looking at the ratio of the different multipoles for our set of 100 observers. And so I'll just explain a few of these. So in each of these ones, we've got the deceleration, the curvature, the jerk, and the Hubble parameters. And these distributions shows the peak will show like where most observers out of the 100 are sitting. And so, for example, this left-hand side is showing the ratio of the dipole relative to the monopole for that parameter. And so we can read this as the deceleration parameter. Almost all of our observers have a dipole, which is 10% of the size of the monopole contribution. And if we look at the Hubble parameter, we can see that the dipole relative to the monopole is very, very small, which is what we expect since our observers are very close to geodesic. So this ratio is very, very tiny. And just a few more examples in this side. Now she's looking at the quadrupole relative to some of the different contributions. And so we can read again in the deceleration parameter, we can read that the quadrupole relative to the dipole, which are these blue distributions. So this is less than 1. So this tells us that for all of our observers, the dipole contribution dominates over the quadrupole. And for H, again, we can see that this blue one, so the quadrupole relative to the dipole is very, very large, which again just tells us that for all of our observers, the quadrupole is the dominant form of the anisotropy. And so do keep an eye out for Jess's work. She's currently applying for PhDs, and so hopefully we'll have something out in the future this kind of more quantitative analysis of the multiple properties among observers. But unfortunately, our real observations don't look like that very well sampled, perfectly isotropic sky. And so we wanted to get more of a rough idea of how these kind of effects might affect some of our cosmological observations. And so we considered a distribution of 300 randomly drawn lines of sight, which look like this on a more wide projection, which is still a very well sampled survey for what we currently have. And so then we do the same process is we calculate these parameters for each line of sight. And to kind of mimic a measurement of these parameters, we then averaged over all of these contributions on the sky. And so we know this isn't how we actually infer parameters. We really plot the magnitude and redshift of supernova, for example, and then find the best fit curve. But we just wanted to kind of get an idea on the level of variance that we might expect based on this anisotropy. And so here what we're looking at, each panel is again showing each one of these effective parameters relative to their EDS counterparts, where each point is one of 1,000 observers in our simulation with a distribution of lines of sight like this, and we're looking at the average for each observer across their sky. On the x-axis is the density contrast at the observer's location, so just where they're sitting. And so because we've got a reasonably fairly sampled sky, we can think of these contributions as being the monopole contribution or the cosmic variance, so the variance that you would expect due to inhomogeneity in the universe, so moving your observer to a different location, more overdense or more underdense. And we can see that by this kind of tight correlation that most of our parameters show with the local density near the observer. And so this is, sorry.
Can I ask a quick question, Haley?
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
So the anisotropy, the inhomogeneity here, you're talking, so the calculations are done locally at each point in this space, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So you're not doing ray tracing over like large distances or anything?
This isn't.
So this is inhomogeneity for each observer when you expand the geometry at each point and calculate those Weissman quantities.
Yes, exactly. Right. So this is based on the series expansion at the observer position. So yeah, it's based on quantities at the observer and local derivatives as well, which obviously take over larger distances. But if I get time at the end, I'll show some work with ray tracing as well if I get to it. So this variance that we see in the effective Hubble parameter, for example, with the local density of the observer, agrees with some studies that have already been done using Newtonian n-body simulation. So we get this kind of few percent variation in the effective Hubble parameter depending on the local environment of the observer. But again, even our observations don't fairly sample. Sorry, no, I forgot about the slide. Okay, before I move on to that, we can now look at how, in addition to this monopole contribution or the kind of isotropic deviation from the Einstein Toolkit model for each observer, we can always also try and quantify how these parameters vary across the sky. And to do that, we calculated this maximal sky deviation, capital delta, which we just defined as being the maximum value of a parameter minus the minimum on an observer's sky relative to the EDS model. So this will kind of give us an idea of the level of variation, for example, we were seeing in those more smooth sky maps, but with a more realistic number of objects. And so here again, each panel is a different parameter, and on the x-axis we have the local environment of the observer, and each point here is one of 1,000 observers showing this maximal sky deviation. And the main point I want you to take away from this slide is that the anisotropic contributions don't care about the local density at the observer. So there's really not much or no correlation with the local density in terms of how large of an anisotropic variation they'll see in these parameters. And that's really just because these anisotropic variations more come from derivatives of the local dynamical environment. However, the actual magnitude of these effects will be smaller in a model universe that had typically lower density contrasts. So while within a particular model universe, your anisotropic effects don't care about what the local density of the observer is, if you then take that whole universe and reduce the density contrast, then these effects will be kind of squished along the y-axis. And so now we thought that even this kind of randomly sampled sky was also quite optimistic for some of our low redshift observations. And so we wanted to consider a really exaggerated case of an unfairly sampled sky and see just how much this might bias some of our low redshift measurements. And so instead, we took this very extreme case of considering, again, 300 lines of sight, but only chosen randomly across one half of the sky. And it's the same half for all observers. And then the same thing, we calculated these parameters for each line of sight and averaged the result. And so this is the same plots we were looking at before, but for this unfairly sampled sky, so just averaging over one half. And we'll notice that the Hubble parameter and the jerk really look basically the same. And the reason for that is that we have, is because of the specific anisotropic contributions that are dominating those parameters. So if we think back to the, I might just flick back to the maps that I had before. So here, for example, in the Hubble parameter and the jerk parameter, we typically have a quadrupole which is dominating. And so if I cut the sky in half in the way that I've done here, that's not going to make much difference to the actual average if I average over this half as opposed to the whole thing. But if we have a dipole dominating the signal, then cutting it in half is obviously going to make a very big difference to the resulting average that I will get. And so that's exactly what we saw in the deceleration parameter and the curvature parameter, as we've gone from these kind of tightly correlated with density to these kind of big amorphous blobs across our observers. And in fact, for the deceleration parameter, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, some observers do actually see a negative value of Q in an EDS, globally EDS simulation. So there is no acceleration of length scales in this simulation, but yet some observers do measure a negative Q, and some even measure beneath this line here, which shows the Lambda Cdm value of Q. And similarly for the curvature parameter, we can see that once these anisotropic variances are affecting your measurement, you're really not probing global properties of the universe anymore. But I will flag again that this was a very drastic unfair sampling, and of course this result is explicitly dependent on that. And if we'd cut the sky in a different way, we would get a totally different result. But this was really just to say that this is something that could make a difference if we're preferentially sampling certain directions. And so this work is useful for finding which multipoles are dominant in each parameter. So for example, we found that the dipole is dominant in the deceleration and curvature parameters, and the quadrupole is dominating in the effective Hubble parameter. And this will then allow us, or can allow us, to simplify the cosmography to fewer degrees of freedom. And so I'm using this result in a paper with Suhail Dahwan and Asta and a summer student of hers to do a physically motivated search for low redshift anisotropies in supernova data. So keep an eye out for this paper. It should be coming out soon. And another paper I'll flag is a recent paper of Asta and mine, again at this archive number here, where we also simplified the cosmography to fewer degrees of freedom by, for example, as Tim mentioned, by assuming our observers are geodesic, and also by using the silent universe, or an extension of the silent universe models which I can say a bit more about if people are interested. But as I mentioned before, we did show that we might run into some convergence issues using this cosmography. So this was related to what I mentioned before, in the sense that we might need up to 8th order terms to be able to approximate the luminosity distance to within 1% out to redshift of 0.15, which is typically the maximum redshift used in local determinations of the Hubble parameter. And so what we need to do is really a more comprehensive study of the convergence properties of this cosmography. And so this is something that we have been working on using exact ray tracing in numerical relativity simulations. And so not only can this help us assess the convergence properties of this series and at what redshift ranges we can actually apply it to data, but it can also help us learn about anisotropies and the luminosity distance at all redshifts. And so I think I still have some time.
Yeah.
So
Haley, can I ask a quick question about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you considered like using a different basis? I mean, you're sort of using like a kind of polynomial in D. Is there, could you use, I don't know, sines or it's a very naive question. I don't know if can you have a better basis where you don't have to go to such a higher order? I don't know.
Maybe, yeah, maybe this is really getting into territory that's Asta's kind of expertise. But there may be some other kind of expansion. I think the motivation for her doing it this way was just because this is how we do it in data analysis at the moment. And the idea was really to just take typical or conventional like FLRW analysis pipelines and just plug in hers instead of the FLRW one.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure if she is exploring other kinds of expansions, but yeah, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you bring in some new complications probably in some other areas. Yeah.
Probably. Yeah. Again, it's not something that I know a lot about. Chris might know more about it if you want to have a discussion after the seminar. But
okay, thanks.
No worries. So yeah, now I'm just going to go into a few more details about some work, again, that Astra and I are doing in studying the accuracy of this cosmography and in capturing the luminosity distance from exact ray tracing. And so I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll just go kind of quickly through the details of this ray tracing. So the idea of what we want to do is to place an observer within the simulation, and instead of just calculating local derivatives, we really want to trace the path of light rays backwards in time out from that observer position to a particular redshift, and then calculate the luminosity distance that observer would measure. And so to do this, we solve the geodesic equation, which is the equation telling us how the photon form momentum evolves along the geodesic, which is parameterized by this S here. I know I've swapped between S and lambda, but they're the same thing. I showed lambda before and now it's S. And then along the geodesic, we can calculate the energy that would be observed by an observer moving with 4 velocity u mu. And then the redshift is just calculated again as the ratio between the energy at the source and the observer. But tracing a single geodesic is not quite enough. What we need to do is to trace a small bundle of geodesics and kind of track how that bundle is like squished and distorted and expanded as it moves through the geometry of space-time, as I just said. And so to do this, I'm skipping a lot of details. I'm going to refer everyone to Pierre Fleury's PhD thesis if you're interested in anything about inhomogeneous light propagation. It's really well written, so please do read it. But what we're doing is we're tracking an infinitesimal beam of light and looking at the separation of geodesics within this bundle along the geodesic. And so these are kind of like, these red lines are all of our geodesics. Here is our observer, and they're going out away from the observer. And so we basically just track this separation vector xi, which tells us how far individual geodesics are from one another in the bundle. And we can just basically evolve that vector along the geodesic, and that tells us how the bundle will behave, assuming it's a small bundle. And so specifically in my code, I advanced the Jacobi matrix, which relates the physical attributes of a source to how it's observed by a particular observer, based on how the image has been distorted along the line of sight. And so the determinant of the matrix with a normalization of photon energy is just the angular diameter distance, which is something that we really measure in cosmological surveys. And then we can relate that to the luminosity distance using the Etherington's reciprocity relation. Struggle to say that word. And I'll just note here that the evolution of the Jacobi matrix is given by this optical tidal matrix, which is made up of the Ricci curvature and the Weil curvature along the geodesic. And so the first test we did was to take the same simulations that we've been looking at through this whole work, and to take the same observers and to ray trace the same lines of sight and just directly compare the luminosity distance that comes from the cosmography to the one that comes from the ray tracer. And so up the top here, we've got sky maps just for one observer of the luminosity distance. So we're not looking at individual parameters anymore. We're just looking at DL relative to the Einstein de Sitter luminosity distance at 3 redshift snapshots. So at 0.03, 0.07, and 0.1. And so because this is a very smooth simulation, we're cutting out all structure beneath 100 megaparsec. We've only got 1% variations from the Einstein de Sitter model. I'll show a more realistic one in a few slides if I have time. And then down the bottom, this is calculated from the cosmography. So this is correct to third order. So the way I do this is just using all of the parameters I've been showing you before, but then taking the calculation of those parameters and putting them into the third order Taylor expansion for the luminosity distance. And so we can see at redshift of 0.03, they're pretty close to one another, but as we go to higher redshifts, the cosmography really does overestimate the anisotropic contributions to the luminosity distance. And so we did the same process for 100 observers in the simulation. And in this plot, this is kind of more quantifying the differences. So what we did was we calculated this kind of L1 difference of the luminosity distance, which is just the difference between the ray traced luminosity distance and the cosmographic luminosity distance for all lines of sight across the observer's sky, and then just averaged them. And we did the same thing for the ray tracing versus the cosmographic luminosity distance, and the ray tracing versus the Einstein de Sitter luminosity distance. And so these 3 panels are the same redshift snapshots that I had on the previous slide. And so these blue points show the difference between the exact ray tracing and the cosmography, and the orange plus signs show the difference between the ray tracing and the EDS. So just focusing on EDS, we can see that at all redshifts, almost all of our observers are within 1% of the EDS luminosity distance averaged over the whole sky. So there are still larger variations in certain directions. But at these low redshifts, the cosmography does about an order of magnitude better at approximating the luminosity distance. And even out to redshift of 0.1, we still capture the luminosity distance to within 1%. So this is actually a little bit better than the estimate that we made in our paper. But as I said, this model universe is extremely smooth. And so it's really nothing like the universe that we actually live in. We really have a lot more small scale structure influencing the evolution of these geodesics. And so now we want to see what happens if we include more small scale structure. So in particular, this is the simulation that this is all preliminary. This is stuff that I'm still investigating, so take with a small grain of salt. But this is a simulation that's 3 gigaparsec on a side. And in the initial data, I've cut out all power beneath 200 megaparsec, but we do form small scale structures later on. And so we did the same process here. I wanted to do the ray tracing and see how well the cosmographic luminosity distance captured in a slightly more realistic model universe. And so this is the same plot we saw before, except we're looking at much lower redshift now. So we're looking at 0.01, 0.02, and 0.04. And we can see that when we add more small scale structure, this cosmographic relation really doesn't do as good of a job. We can see that at 0.02, it's already failing with respect to the exact luminosity distance. And so this is something that we're still looking at, and we've got some other projects in which we're interested in trying to find the best way to kind of mold the cosmography to be able to use it in a more realistic universe. So doing some kind of smoothing to our cosmological data. And just to flash this up in my last minute, I also was like, well, let's go one step further and try and do an even more realistic model universe. And so here is the same simulation, but just with slightly more small scale structure. You can see that we've gone from this kind of more fuzzy universe to something that has much more smaller scale structure. And for this case here are the sky maps of we're just looking at ray tracing. We've kind of said the cosmography won't do a good job in this sense. So just the exact ray tracing results for one observer down here. We have the luminosity distance with respect to EDS for these, again, these 3 redshifts, 0.03, 0.07, and 0.1. And even at 0.1, we can see we've still got plus or minus like 4.5% variations in the luminosity distance across the sky. And so I did this same calculation for 25 observers, I think. And so then I calculated this kind of the same thing as we were looking at in the paper, this maximal sky variance of the luminosity distance, which is just the max minus the minimum variance across the sky in these kind of maps. And this is as a function of the mean redshift, or the redshift of these slices here. And so we can see this anisotropy, basically it drops off with redshift as we expect, but even at redshifts of 0.1 and up to about 0.15, we still have a few percent effects varying across the sky. And so I'm really interested in looking into this more in the context of how this might affect our cosmological inference. And that's all I've got. So just to conclude is that the coefficients of luminosity distance cosmography really generalize in non-trivial ways in the presence of low redshift, inhomogeneity, and anisotropy. And even in the monopole limit, when we averaged over a fairly sampled sky, we did find differences from the FLRW model. So this cosmic variance, which does appear in all parameters, not just the Hubble parameter, as has previously been studied. And on top of this, we also have these anisotropic contributions across the observer's sky, which may impact surveys which have an incomplete sky coverage. And this work really helped us determine what might constitute a reasonable assumption in simplifying the cosmography to be able to actually apply it to real data, which is something we're trying to do now. And then we went one step further and looked into ray tracing using full GR to try and assess the convergence of this approximation, which again is something we're still working on quantifying, so keep an eye out for that as well. And these ray tracing tools are really applicable beyond the work that I've shown here, and there's a variety of different things I'm interested in looking into. So if there's anything that anyone finds particularly interesting, then please let me know. I'd be happy to hear. And that's all. Thank you.